thank you for stopping by and welcome to Friday Sews, the weekly vlog where I talk about what I have been doing this week with my sewing and what I plan to do in the next week with it. If you watched last week's Friday Sews, you will remember that I had Barbie clothes on my to-do list. I had an early 80s pullover kit that I was going to get started on, and I had a Revolutionary War costume that was more of a long-term project that I was going to start investigating and sort of clarifying my ideas on that. And all of those things are still on my to-do list, but I got distracted by something shiny. In my last week's video, somebody commented, this Jedi Crafts commented about a Star Wars pattern he had bought that was super expensive, and that sent me down a whole rabbit hole about sewing patterns for costumes and things. I want to talk a little bit about that sewing pattern and also a costume that I have started that I need to hurry up and get done because I want to get a video on it posted by May the 4th because it is a Star Wars related costume. I've got the fabric port right here and I'll go over that in a minute. And I also wanted to just briefly look at a sewing gadget that I found that is supposed to thread a needle for you. It's an old 1950s sewing gadget, super cute. Let's start by talking about the Barbie clothes, which I had meant to be working on full blast until I got started on them, and it was a lot more difficult than I expected. I'm using this sort of satiny fabric, and I've never worked with satiny, slippery fabrics before. There's not a lot of call for it in menswear, except for linings and things like that, but I often use even a more structured lining. So I have gone through a few iterations of trying to make this dress, and man, am I struggling. I finally figured out to just sort of interface it with something to add more structure. It keeps it from fraying. I don't really like the way the interfacing looks on the inside, but it just is super necessary to keep it all together. So what I think I'm going to do is get some fusible webbing so I can just use a better looking fabric to interface this, or even maybe interface the same fabric together so that it looks the same on both sides, but it will give it a little bit more structure. But that was the first big challenge I have tried to overcome making these little tiny clothes. The second is marking. It's way too small of markings needed for me to use chalk like I normally do, and it's very precise. I will sometimes just fudge it if I'm sewing for myself. But with these clothes, if I just try to fudge the marks, it doesn't come out right. So I used a pen, and it was all great with that until I ironed it, and then the pen ink bleeds through to the outer side. And my very first attempt at this bodice here, Barbie got a couple little dots like right at the apex of the bust darts. And that is not the area you want to be highlighting with a little black, dot. So I'm trying to figure out how to get some sort of marking system that I can mark from the wrong side and it won't bleed through to the front and it'll maybe wash out. I know there are different types of pens that have a finer tip. I'm going to try to figure that out. But speaking of bust darts, I have never made bust darts before, and trying to do them precisely on a little tiny bodice is really difficult. I did not expect that, so I have gone through a few versions of it, and I am currently working on one that seems to be doing all right. I'll wait until I see how it comes out in the very end. So this is what I've got so far with this version of the bodice. It's really hard trying to iron the little bust darts down and everything like that. I'm struggling with that, but I will get better at it, I think. So another issue that I'm having is finishing the edges. What the pattern calls for is to just clip in the seam allowance and then turn it under and iron it down. And that works all right, but I've not been able to get it to where it doesn't flap around and it just doesn't look right. So I started experimenting with just overcasting the edges using some embroidery thread, and I've had to play around a little bit with like thread tension and the stitch length to do if I do too tight of a satin stitch, it starts bunching up. I eventually got one that is looking much better here on the side. Focus. So I'm getting there. I did try also whip stitching by hand, but my hand threading or my hand sewing is awful, so that didn't come out looking great. So I'm thinking that just playing around with this like a satin stitch and overcasting the edge is going to be the way to go, and maybe using some matching thread or interesting contrast thread could work well too. But I don't know, if I wanted to try making little tiny facings for this, that might be really difficult to sew on. All said, I just really need to put more work into doing this little tiny sewing. I was not expecting it to present as many challenges as it did. I thought, oh, I'm just going to zoom through this and it'll be great. Another issue I had was with my little toy sewing machine. I don't know if it's in shot. So I intended to do this on the toy sewing machine, and it works, but a couple of problems with that. First of all, it does not work on the satin material very well. And then once I start interfacing it, it doesn't work very well on like thicker, more structured material. There's just like a sort of middle ground that you have to use. Pretty much anything other than like quilting cotton sort of material is not doing great on that little toy hand crank machine. I guess that makes sense. It's not that, fancy of a machine. It's just really cool still, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to actually make these little dresses on it. I'm going to keep working on improving my techniques for sewing little tiny clothes, and it'll be a fun side project for now, but it's not ready for prime time. I will make a video of all of that once I get a little bit better at the process. Everything's a learning curve, and I wasn't expecting something so simple to be so much of a learning curve, but my delicate manipulation isn't that great. And also with these delicate fabrics and just some of the things from women sewing like bust darts that I had never encountered before are throwing me for a loop, and doing them in miniature is extra challenging. Moving on to updates from something else from last week, the Ultra pullover from the early 1980s, or 1980 to be specific. This is still on the to-do list, but if you'll remember, it's a kit where all of the pieces are already cut out. And I thought, what if I really liked this, like how it fits or just the way it looks, how would I be able to duplicate it? And I realized I really should take all of the pieces and trace them off into a pattern before I sew it together. That way I could duplicate this with maybe a material I liked better after I have put this kit together. So that's what I'm going to be doing. That's one of the reasons I've put it on the back burner, because I want to make sure that when I do make this pullover, I give it my best shot and I'm not just rushing through it to get to something else that I'm more interested in. So that's going to be going into my work in progress pile and sitting there for a bit, but it is upcoming in the future. And the third thing that I talked about last week was this Revolutionary War sewing pattern. So this is a simplicity pattern from the Bicentennial for men's Revolutionary War uniform, basically, like a fancy uniform. And I wanted to start on this to make it for July 4th, which is a ways out, but I wanted to go through and see if I could find some cool materials for it, like some more accurate stuff. Maybe just look up a little bit of history about it. I'm not, doing any sort of historically accurate anything really. This is definitely still high on my to-do list, and I'm excited to get started with it. But I do want to go through a video of going through the pattern and everything, and breaking down the materials and talking about where I found the materials. So I've got to go all through all of that, and then I will try to make a video going through the whole process of getting ready to sew this project. That brings me to the cool vintage sewing gadget that I'm going to be fiddling around with. It comes in this really cute little box. It's covered with leather. Can you see this? Thread-o-matic. It's called a Thread-o-matic, and this, very 1950s, 1940s box. So this is what it looks like if it will stay in focus. And you're supposed to put a needle in here and push down on this part, and it sort of automatically threads the needle, which seems like an overly complicated gadget for people who already know how to sew or thread sewing needles. But here's the deal, I'm terrible at threading sewing needles, so I normally just run the thread through it and use a double tail. I have never really successfully threaded a needle because it's just too delicate for me to really get my big clumsy hands through. Unless I'm using a big fat honking needle and thick thread, then I can do it all right. But normal thread and normal needles, I am not that great at doing it. Now let's talk about the biggest sewing project that I'm doing right now, and I'm suddenly all excited about, even though last week it hadn't even crossed my mind. I am making a Jedi costume for May the 4th. And I am doing this from a pattern that is fairly difficult to find. They're out there, but they are not, they're not cheap. They are not easy to get in good condition. So I'm super excited to have found this pattern. Let's see. It is, I have Simplicity 0579. don't know how well you can see that with the reflection. So these are much coveted patterns in the Star Wars costuming community at one point, apparently, because they were just generally considered to be one of the better like costume patterns for Star Wars. And apparently Simplicity pulled them off the shelf in the late aughts due to copyright issues. I guess there was a lawsuit over like Star Wars armor in the UK, and Simplicity got sort of sketchy because they were worried Lucasfilms was becoming litigious, and so they pulled all their Star Wars costumes patterns off the shelves, and these were hard to find, but I have one in perfect factory folded condition. It's never been used. It's got a little maple leaf on it, so it must have been the Canadian version of this pattern. Well, not Canadian version, it was sold to the Canadian market, is what I'm guessing that maple leaf means. But I sold an arm and a leg and bought this pattern. This pattern isn't in as high of demand as it once was, although that hasn't affected the price point apparently. But I guess Simplicity has re-released it, and a lot of people who want this pattern will be using the re-released version rather than, you know, selling their firstborn child to get the original version of it. And I also went ahead and bought the re-released version of this pattern so I could compare the two. And that is actually, I think, going to be my next full video that I do, is a piece-to-piece comparison of these two patterns. And I can already tell you right now there are some pretty significant differences between the pattern in total. First of all, the robes in the re-release are not at all like the robes in the original. Just looking at the line art, I can tell you that this is the tabards from the original. Like maybe they call it chest armor, and then this little piece. Those are different looking from the line art in the next one, the re-release. Let's see if we can. So if you'll notice in this one, the chest armor only comes down to the waist. It doesn't drop all the way down. I know that's fairly easy to, you know, change up, but the pattern itself doesn't include it. And I know a lot of people like to use these costume patterns who don't really know how to draft patterns on their own, myself included. I'm not a good pattern drafter. And sometimes it's just easy and fun to use a pattern rather than having to make it yourself. Also, this, like, I think they call it a dicky. This piece looks shorter in the line drawings of this new one than it does of this original one. So this dicky part looks like it's different too. There's also, this is the original one. You notice the shoulders are very straight. In the re-release, it looks like it has a drop shoulder to it. All of that is to say that I think there are some significant differences between these two. So like I said, I'm gonna make a video going through comparing piece by piece and just looking at the instructions and everything, and overall how easy I think each one is to follow, and just how much I like the look of each pattern. I am not going to make both of them. I'm going to make the original one for my costume, which brings me to the fabric, and this is what I spent last weekend doing, mostly was getting this project in my head. And I went and got some fabric to make the whole Jedi costume out of, and let me say, I was way more money than I had intended to spend last weekend, but I just really, I got this in my mind and I couldn't let it go. Like, as soon as I saw the comment about this rare, hard to find sewing pattern, like that's all it takes for me to be super interested in it. So of course I had to get it immediately. And then once I saw it and I knew May the 4th was coming up, I was like, okay, this is it. This is what I want to be doing with myself for the next month. And I just got super energetic about it. So all my previous plans just flew out of my head and I got like distracted by this shiny new object. So let's look at the fabric. For this, I am making a Jedi costume. I am not making an Obi-Wan Kenobi costume. So I'm not going by any existing Jedi from the film franchise. I am making up my own Jedi, so I'm going to be sort of my own concept of a Jedi. I decided to go with a little bit shinier, more sci-fi looking fabric for this costume, rather than an earthy, natural fiber looking fabric, just because that fits better with the vision I have of this character that I want to create. And also, I like the idea that a little bit more vanity in the fabric of the Jedi's clothing implies a little bit more potential to turn to the dark side. This Jedi character I'm thinking of is one who is on the side of the light, but he's keeping his options open just in case. So let's take a look at the fabric that I'm going to be using, starting for like the dicky, like the main part of the costume. This fabric sort of has that natural beige looking tone, sort of like Obi-Wan Kenobi. So it sort of keeps in that theme, but it's also sort of shiny and reflective, which just makes it a little bit more fancy, a little bit more vain, which is what I'm going for. Just a traditional Jedi look with a hint of vanity to it. So that is the main fabric that I'm going to be using. For the chest armor, or like the tabard sort of thing, I am using a brown. This one is poly. The main one is a poly, but it was super cheap and it's exactly what I was looking for. This one is a linen rayon knit. This is going to be the tabard chest piece thing. And I'm going for brown, so already I'm sticking the same color themes as Obi-Wan Kenobi. I'm just using different texture and like reflectiveness to imply that it is a little bit more vain. So this one is, again, it just a little bit smoother, just a little bit more reflective, just a little bit more sci-fi looking, I feel. Let's look at the fabric I got to make the robe now. And this one was the biggest outlay of money by far because I needed, what, like 6.5 yards of it? And it is 100% linen. Why I decided on 100% linen, who knows? Other than the only thing that's not linen in it is there are some cross threads, metallic cross threads. So it has a reflective like shininess to it as well, which I thought was very spacey, sci-fi, and also just sorts of in keeping with the ongoing theme of the vain Jedi. So this character is going to be loosely based off a role-playing character I had in the 90s from Star Wars role-playing game, 2nd edition. It was a D6 based gaming system, and I had so much fun with that because it was always a lot of action, very fast-paced. A lot of my favorite Star Wars memories come from playing this role-playing game in the 90s, so the Star Wars that lives in my head is often not at all like the Star Wars that you see on screen, but that's why I like role-playing games so much. They allow players to make the world what they want it to be and just have fun with it. So now I'm gonna get started comparing these two Star Wars costume patterns to each other to see how similar they really are. That video should be up early next week, hopefully by Wednesday. I really appreciate you all for stopping by to check in and see how things are going. If you've liked this video, please let me know by giving it a like. And if you have not already, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the future.